Why didn't the US annex the Yucatan Peninsula? The Yucatan Peninsula was once home to the great Maya civilization, and since then has fallen under the control of the Spanish Empire, the Mexican Empire, and the modern Republic of Mexico. But for a few strange weeks, a series of strange and bloody circumstances made it so that this ancient land nearly became a new addition to the United States of America. This strange story is befitting of a strange region. The Yucatan had long been a hard and deadly frontier for the European colonists. The difficult terrain with few navigable rivers and an abundance of disease was tough for the Europeans to live in, while the scattered native Maya fiercely defended their independence well into the 17th century. When Spain finally did establish some control, that control was weak, with local elites known as hidalgos retaining significant power far from central government oversight. The Yucatan briefly saw independence as a republic in 1823, after Mexico's successful war for independence from Spain, but within months, it chose to join Mexico. Mexico sent a governor to Yucatan, but functionally, the local hidalgos and other elites continued to enjoy a lot of freedom. This was not a privilege extended to the native Maya, who faced heavy discrimination and oppression in law, politics, work, and social life. Their lives were little better than slavery on European or mestizo plantations, as their language, culture, and people were marginalized and erased. Eventually, in 1841, the Yucatecan nobles decided that Mexico's oversight was too much and declared their independence again. Mexico was facing a cascade of problems at the time, including the control of Texas and attempted internal coups, which led to the toppling of President Anastasio Bustamante by Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. Santa Anna initially tried to negotiate with this new Yucatecan republic, but when those negotiations went nowhere, he resorted to military options. Santa Anna seized Ciudad de Carmen, crippling trade access to the Yucatan, and sent an army onto the peninsula. However, the Republic had already raised an army thousands of men strong, almost all of them Maya, which forced the Mexican forces to withdraw and begrudgingly accept its autonomy. Still, within Yucatan, there was a lot of disagreement over what should be done. The Campeche faction of Santiago Mendez generally favored union with Mexico, while the Merida faction of Miguel Barbachano was more inclined to independence. The governorship of Yucatan switched constantly between them both. Each held it 3 times between 1841 and 1846, never for more than 18 months at a time, resulting in Yucatan lurching between reunification and independence multiple times. By late 1846, the two factions were so divided that Yucatan effectively had 2 governments at once, each with different stances on Yucatan's independence. Things got more complicated with the outbreak of the Mexican-American War in April 1846. The more pro-unification Mendez did not want to involve the Yucatan in a war with the United States and urged for independence and neutrality. And it was generally pro-independence Barbachano who favored sticking with Mexico. The United States decided the issue for them in October 1846, when it sent a naval force under Commodore Matthew Perry to capture Ciudad de Carmen and put the Yucatan under a naval blockade. Washington, it seemed, considered the Yucatan fair game. The Yucatan Republic sent an envoy to Washington in January 1847 to plead for recognition of the Republic's neutrality, which was eventually accepted, although Ciudad de Carmen was not relinquished. For a moment, things looked like they might be fine, but they got a whole lot worse in July 1847, when the Yucatecan Maya, led by Manuel Antonio I. Cecily Chi and Jacinto Pat, sensing the weakness of the government, began planning a revolt. Their plan was discovered and I was executed, but his death simply made him a martyr. Chi and Pat led the Maya in an open revolt that rapidly spread across the peninsula in a new conflict known as the Caste War. Unfortunately, the Caste War was the textbook definition of a race war. The Maya sought the complete expulsion of the whites by death or driving them into the sea, while the whites sought the total subjugation of the Maya and the extermination of any who would not kneel. After executing I in the town of Tipich, The Yucatan forces, under Mendez's command, cracked down on Maya in the surrounding area, arresting and executing dozens and burning their homes. The Maya responded in kind, attacking the town in July and killing every non-Maya they found. The Maya still formed the bulk of the labor, and the military personnel on the Yucatan so quickly gained control of the rural areas, isolating the white population in the major cities. The government of Yucatan needed help, and they felt that the best place to get that was in Washington. In late 1847, Mendez's son-in-law, Justo Sierra O'Reilly, was sent as another envoy to plead for American support. O'Reilly urged the Americans to lift their tariffs and embargoes, especially on weapons. A shrewd diplomat, he also suggested that the British and the Spanish were secretly supporting the Maya, playing on American fears of European expansion in their own backyard. For years now, America had operated under the Monroe Doctrine, which compelled them to oppose any further expansion of European imperial power in the Americas. Raising the specter of European intervention was a clever move to force the Americans to pay attention. O'Reilly's pleas earned some sympathy, and he managed to get the tariffs and embargoes reduced. But the situation back in Yucatan was getting rapidly worse. By early 1848, the Maya had the Yucatan government on the ropes. Thousands had died between both sides, and there was a real possibility of the Maya expelling or exterminating the whites from the peninsula. Desperate, in March 1848, the Yucatecan government sent identical letters to the Americans, the British, and the Spanish. Whoever sent the Yucatan aid would be granted domination and sovereignty over the whole peninsula. Better to live as subjects to America, Spain, or Britain than to be wiped out by the Maya. Back in Washington, O'Reilly had been writing to the newspapers to publicize the plight of the Yucatan and arranging meetings with key senators and officials. He had officially secured a meeting with President Polk in April, when word reached him of his government's unprecedented offer. O'Reilly was exasperated. He hated the idea on principle, and was shocked at how bad the situation had become. The entire dynamic of the debate just shifted under his feet, and the news reached him only the day before he was supposed to meet the president. Polk was at least interested in the new development. The end of the Mexican-American War in February had freed up his attention, and the risk of British or Spanish expansion in the region was a big concern. Polk listened to O'Reilly intently, and less than a week later stood before Congress to plead the case for American intervention in the Yucatan. It wasn't just about geopolitics, but a racial concern, with the president calling on Congress to vote to, quote, rescue the white race from extermination or expulsion from their country. The Yucatan Bill proposed a military intervention and occupation of the Yucatan to suppress the Maya rebels and perhaps pave the way for a full annexation of the peninsula. But whatever relief O'Reilly felt when his country's issues started being taken seriously quickly evaporated. The bill immediately became a battleground for the two dominant political parties. The Democrats favored intervention, while the Whigs opposed it. The Whigs argued that America had no reason to involve itself in a faraway war in the first place, and feared they would only provoke another war with Mexico. The Democrats argued it was America's duty under the Monroe Doctrine to set up before the Europeans did, and saw parallels between Yucatan and America's own conflicts with native populations. More than anything, the Yucatan was a partisan fight. The actual issues in Yucatan were secondary. Eyes were already turning toward the 1848 presidential election, and the controversial Yucatan Bill had become one of the first battlegrounds, with people on all sides bunkering down with their respective party and using the debate to smear opponents. Before long, O'Reilly's hope had turned to despair. He wrote in his diary, "The Whigs have taken their stand in the matter, and the Democrats theirs. Thus the question of Yucatan is a party question, and as such, God knows the fate that will befall it." Several weeks of chaotic political mudslinging occurred until news suddenly reached Washington on May 16th. The Yucatan government had just signed a peace treaty with the Maya. The war, it seemed, was over. The Yucatan Bill died overnight. Keen to be rid of the political controversy around it, the Senate killed the Yucatan Bill, and President Polk's interest vanished too. O'Reilly was humiliated. His warnings about the danger of the conflict now seemed like exaggerated nonsense. So sudden and so total was the abandonment of the Yucatan Bill that the same papers who had lent column space to O'Reilly's pleas weeks earlier now refused to even publish him. The treaty between the Yucatan government and the rebels was broken almost immediately, but Washington's attention had already been lost by that point. The Yucatan government once again turned to Mexico City, who sent troops to suppress the rebels in exchange for the Republic rejoining the country. By 1849, the rebels had been pushed into the southeast of the peninsula, and the Mexican flag once again flew over it. The Caste War dragged on a similar scale until 1901, and the Yucatan remains a piece of Mexico to this day. The brief few years of its blood-soaked independence and the prospect of a United States occupation and annexation are now distant, easily forgotten anecdotes in the long history of the Yucatan Peninsula.